Focus of this lecture is on Christian education. So we're kind of turning our attention away from some of the educational theory stuff to focus on the purpose of education and discipleship, which leads us to this question: what is the purpose of Christian education? What is the purpose of youth group and Sunday school and all of these things that happen in the church, especially with youth? Is it nurture? Are we trying to catechize our young people, which really means to kind of indoctrinate them in a positive way, to help them understand the faith and the tradition, and to kind of pass the tradition along, or to pass on faith to our children? Or is it conversion? Are we seeking change and transformation? And this is where evangelization would come in, presenting them with the gospel. Which of these perspectives informs the way we do our Christian education? Now, I think most people are going to say, well, it's both. But as we look at different churches and church communities and organizations, you're going to see that they're going to tip kind of one way or the other. And so how should we begin to think about the relationship between nurture and conversion as we think about Christian education? So I want to introduce you to some thinkers in the field, and they've written books that I'm not making you read, but we'll talk about with you. And the first one is John Westerhoff. He wrote a book called Our Children Have Faith, and he wrote this back, I think, in the 70s, and then it was kind of issued in the 2000s. He's an Episcopal priest, and he was asking the question about passing on the tradition or belief to young people, and he's really asking questions about Christian education. What is it that we're doing? Now, one of the things that he's critical of is the ways in which churches just simply adopt kind of what he calls the schooling instructional paradigm, that we treat Sunday school and youth group in a similar sense as we would treat school. Now, this can go a couple of different ways. On the one hand, it can go, passing on information, lecturing, making them memorize things, memorize Bible verses, that kind of thing. So the kind of old school methods of teaching. But increasingly, you could argue that it's the new methods as well, the small groups and so on. And I think it's important to see that he's critiquing, I think, both. That there are assumptions hidden kind of within the curriculum of this model of education. There's a sense in which we treat students like these receptacles that we're going to pour information into. They're the tabula rasa, the blank slates, that John Locke would talk about, and that the focus is on giving them information. The focus is, in a sense, control by trying to influence what they believe and how they think morally and so on. The focus is very much on religion and memorizing scripture and memorizing catechisms and so on. And in a way, what this does is it really focuses on maintaining the status quo, that the purpose of Christian education is to form and shape the belief and faith of our young people to be just like our faith. And so students are receptacles. We want them to just simply take the information in, become good little believers, and then move on. Now, his argument is this denies agency and therefore dehumanizes young people, that by treating them in this way, we're not actually attending to the humanity of young people made in the image of God, and he sees a problem with approaching Christian education in this way. He also talks about the broken ecology. So he says that churches are having less influence. So increasingly, they're being more shaped by the institutions of school, work, popular culture, athletics. You can think about all of these different outside kind of forces that are forming and shaping our young people. Family would be another one, although he would argue that family has changed and is maybe even under stress, and so therefore its connection with kind of the Christian community is faltering. And so really the question then is, well, where is formation happening? Church used to be closer to the center of social life, family life, very central to what people did. Well, that's just not the case anymore. And so now the question is, given this, what is Christian education about? And how do we understand youth ministry and All those types of questions come up. Now, he is going to focus a little bit more on a liberation theology perspective. Again, he's writing in the 70s, and so liberation theology is becoming a bigger deal. And what he wants to emphasize from liberation theology is a focus on God's agency, that God is at work in the lives of young people, God is at work in the world, that young people are not just simply receptacles, they don't have blank slate minds, but they have experiences, they have language, they have culture, and so we need to begin with that human experience. And that the focus of Christian education then should be freedom and humanization. Now, in the context of Northwest Iowa, in the context of suburban life, it seems strange to come at it from a liberation theology perspective. But what he's arguing, I think, is that because of the broken ecology, what we end up with are certain ideologies and certain ways of thinking about the world that kind of ingrain themselves within young people, and that our task in Christian education is to get them to see the world differently, to help foster agency in the context of the gospel, and to humanize them in the context of the gospel. We're going to see this again with Paulo Freire, but it's a way of thinking about Christian education and youth ministry that is focused on cultivating kind of the humanity and the agency of young people in the context of the gospel, in the context of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, you've heard me say this again and again. What does it mean to live as the new humanity of Jesus Christ? How do we help young people live into this way of life? This becomes the focus of Christian education for Westerhoff, and he believes this is what we really need to focus on. Parker Palmer is another person who is not necessarily writing specifically from a Christian perspective or for Christian schooling, but really I think his ideas can be applied very easily to what we're talking about. So this book, To Know As We Are Known, Education is a Spiritual Journey, it's old, but it's good. And what he does in this really short, easy-to-read book is he kind of unpacks an approach to education that can push back against this objectivist paradigm that he talks about. So like Westerhoff, he sees education and schooling kind of caught within this kind of objectivist paradigm. The focus is on information. It's grounded in control. It's all about power, the power dynamics between the teacher and the students. And it leads to a form of education that fosters competition, it objectifies, it dehumanizes, and it fosters fear and anxiety, and is kind of grounded in violence. And he's arguing for a different way of doing education that is grounded in love. Now, not the soft kind of permissiveness of love, but love as the opening up to the other, as the humanization of the other, as the non-objectification of the other. And so he wants us to see truth not in this objective kind of control, we're going to get the facts and information and this is the truth about the world, but truth as relational, this way in which the world gives itself to us, we receive it, we give ourselves to the world, we give ourselves to one another, and this recognition that education and Christian education is grounded not in control, but in love and compassion and mercy and the formation of a people who are curious and who are interested and who receive the world as it gives itself. He too talks about the hidden curriculum of modern education that he believes fosters violence and control and this kind of objectivist paradigm, and believes that the classroom needs to be a place where we create space for young people to begin to see the world differently, to receive the world differently, to be invited into a different way of life. And we need to cultivate a space within our Christian education programs that helps young people begin to think differently. And so you can begin to see how the nurture-conversion issue gets a little more complicated here. And we'll kind of come back to that at the end of the presentation. Another person who I think is really important in the cultivation of Christian perspectives of Christian education is Thomas Groome. And he comes at it from this praxis theory praxis. So if you remember way back to Introduction to Practical Theology, we talked about the pastoral cycle of experience, reflection, action, or praxis theory, new praxis. And this is how he believes we need to begin to approach Christian education and youth ministry and formation. That again, young people are not simply blank slates or receptacles to have information dumped into, but they have their own lived experience, their own language, their own understanding of the world. And so what we need to do is speak into that. We need to understand it, and we need to help them begin to awaken to their experience of the world. And what he wants us to do is also recognize we need to externalize kind of this objective reality, that young people have internalized a way of thinking about the world that is grounded in competition, it is grounded in violence, it's grounded in patriarchy. And he's saying that those things need to be externalized, that we need to help young people see that that's not necessarily the way the world is, it's the way that they've been formed and shaped by some of the institutional aspects of the culture in which they live. And so we need to do that by beginning to wrestle with questions and different issues, beginning with their questions. So what are the questions that young people are asking? What are the issues that they are struggling with? And how do we begin with those things and then begin to try to re-narrate the objective reality, and do so now by bringing in the biblical story? So it's a sense in which we start with the narratives of young people, the issues that young people are wrestling with, and trying to understand their lived experience. And then as we try to re-narrate, we externalize that reality and we re-narrate reality. We do so now using the symbols and the language of the biblical story. And that's everything we've been talking about in effective Bible teaching. What is the Bible? How do we teach it? We do it with theology by helping them think about some of the theological categories and our way of thinking about God's action and God's presence in the world. And we do it with the communal liturgical practices, prayer, scripture reading, singing. All of these things are a way of kind of reshaping and re-narrating how we interact with the world. And this is what Christian education becomes, and this is what youth ministry becomes. Again, what is the purpose of a pizza party? It's not just to waste time. It's not just to be silly. It is to try to re-narrate community. Who do we engage with? Who do we sit by? How does food open us up to an engagement with one another? And we may not even have to tell students that this is what we're doing. But the practice of eating together, the practice of playing games, can actually begin to help re-narrate their reality and help them to see things a little bit differently. What we don't want to do is just simply foster a way of doing Christian education and youth ministry that confirms the status quo. We're constantly inviting them into the way of discipleship following Jesus Christ, which brings us back to the book we read at the very beginning, Being Disciples with Rowan Williams. We're invited into a different way of seeing the world, a different way of inhabiting the world, a presence within the world, and we do that by helping them understand the biblical story and bringing it to bear upon their life. Now, the different practices that Groom talks about in the Christian community are all listed here, and you have the Latin or the Greek on the one side, and then what it means. But basically, these practices are koinonia and hospitality, witness, worship, service, proclamation, and then teaching, and that these are all practices of the church that we use to form and shape the identity and the lives of young people. And these are the practices of the entire Christian community. And how do we invite young people to participate in these practices? Now, it's also important to see how for Groom, faith becomes both personal and social. So it is about the individual, but it is also about a way of being in the world. And so he wants us to see this. So Christian education is about faith. It's about the individual coming to believe certain things, but it's also inviting them to action or a way of life. So youth ministry, Christian education has to be also about hope. helping them see the Christian community as a place where identities get re-narrated and the future gets opened up to us. There's a new possibility for the future. The resurrection of Jesus Christ throws history wide open. And when we think about young people and the determinism and the fatalism that they tend to have, this is the way that the world is, why should I bother, why should I try? They need to hear that word of hope. They need to have us cast a vision of a different way of being in the world. And so Groom believes that a big part of what we do as teachers, as youth leaders, is help them struggle against all of the forces at work in this world that deny life, that are opposed to the humanity of Jesus Christ, that are opposed to this kingdom life that he talks about. So that the church and the Christian community exists to make life more human, that we're inviting young people to awaken to their humanity and to awaken to the humanity of others in a way in which they come to believe personally, so they come to a personal belief, but that belief then opens them up to take action in the world. And what he wants to say is all of our structures and programming needs to both deepen faith and enable action in the world. Help young people come to understand what it is that they believe, but then also enable action in the world. So for Groom, and I think this is really important and really helpful, Christian education is both nurture and conversion. We're passing on a tradition. We're passing on a knowledge of faith. We preserve it faithfully so that we pass it on to our kids. But we're also helping to convert them to a way of life that is different, that sees the world differently, and that leads to action. This involves unmasking the powers, spending time in youth group and Christian education, helping them recognize the forces at work in this world that can be dehumanizing, and also proclaiming hope, constantly proclaiming hope. Young people inhabit spaces and places that close the future off, that want to say, this is who you are, there's nothing more to life, it's all about money, it's all about sex, it's all about power, this is what you need to go after. And it opens up the possibility that there's other ways of being in the world and that there's a possibility of a new future. This is what Christianity proclaims. And so this is what it means to say Christian education and youth ministry need to be humanizing. Again, humanizing in the context of the gospel, in the context of the death and resurrection of Jesus, prophetically denouncing the powers of this world and proclaiming the new world and the new humanity. And this is what Christian education is about. So it is about that last line there. It's a community that practices faith and culturation. We're inviting them into certain beliefs and practices that shape who they are, that then shape their engagement of the world. Now, I am not saying that they're going to understand that this is what you're doing. Now, you need to be able to articulate this to the stakeholders, the head pastor, the elders and deacons, the parents. Understand this is what I'm doing and this is why I'm doing it. But all of the things that you do, whether it's pizza parties, mission trips, teaching times, small group, local service projects, even bonfires and just going out in the woods, that kind of stuff, all of it needs to be framed within this understanding of what it is that we're doing. This humanizing power of the gospel to awaken young people to life in Jesus Christ, so that they come both to have a personal faith, but they also, from that personal faith, develop an identity out of which they then engage the world. So we can see here that the question of nurture versus conversion is really a false dilemma, and that the answer is both. But it's both, I think, in a way that Groom and Palmer and Westerhoff help us see it's a little bit different. It is about kind of cultivating this way of life. It is about opening them up to see the possibility of a new future. And all of this is possible only because of the death and resurrection of Jesus. We want them to have a personal faith in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And this is a way of framing what that means. What it means for them to grow in faith and to deepen their faith. And so this really is, I think, the important way in which we can begin to think about Christian education. This is a way for us to frame it. And we're going to go on and we're going to begin talking about some other approaches to education. We're going to look at Paulo Freire. We're going to look at Kieran Egan. And then we're going to, soon getting into these very practical ways in which we can plan lessons and do this teaching that shapes and forms in the way that we're talking about. But here I think this lecture has been an attempt to just kind of frame this is what education is about. And from there we'll continue on in the conversation to try to dig down a little deeper.